Hello and welcome to Dr. K's Psychobabble in that hip tune that starts off every one of these videos. So welcome to the discussion we're going to have today on Zone of Proximal Development, primarily the work of Lev Vygotsky. And let's get a little bit of bio about Lev here. Lev was born in Belarus on November 17th, 1996, and a mere 37 years later, died of tuberculosis. Now, he was in Moscow when he died, and that short period of time in which he was on the earth, he went through a lot of different theories and different things that he contributed. He didn't get his degrees until much later. Much of what we know about him, he had already accomplished by the time that he published his dissertation. In fact, I think his dissertation was published posthumously after he had died. The work that was going on in Russia was highly isolated because of the status of the Russian government, and certainly this was leading up to World War II and the revolutions that were going on in that time. So tough time to be a psychologist. He was aware, however, of the work of another psychologist or a person important in this development, and that is Jean Piaget, who was born actually the same year. Now, while Piaget's work came into the Western consciousness, it really dynamically uplifted the how we approached education, and kind of ushered in what we call today, which is essentially constructivism. And to explain that kind of concept of constructionism, I went backwards there for a little bit, sorry about that. To explain that a little bit, let's look at Piaget's primary sense was that learning occurred through a process, an internal process of assimilation and accommodation. So essentially, when you look at the word constructivism, knowledge as it exists within our mind, we call that schemas. It's built up of schemas, which are ideas or concepts. Like you can have a concept for a car, and some of us have a very simplistic view of what a car is, and others have a much more complex view of a car. And that arises because over time, we experience things and we accommodate new information into that schema, and we build that. We assimilate new information into that schema and then accommodate existing information about that schema to produce the what we know about that particular thing. And we look at this as kind of a construction process. Now, Vygotsky's work was a lot about the social nature of work, and he was of learning, and he was very interested in the way people interacted and how important that was for learning. In fact, one of the other theories that Vygotsky has to do with private speech. Now, Piaget recognized that there was private speech, but he felt that private speech faded over time, that we no longer use this. Now, what private speech is, if you ever look at a child who's learning, and what will happen, and this is according to Vygotsky, is that the social nature of learning is so important that in the absence of other people, we actually talk to ourselves. So you imagine a small child going there, narrating to themselves what they're doing, like I'm moving this, if they're making a puzzle, I'm going to do this. And that outward expression of speech to themselves, called private speech, Piaget felt that fades over time. However, Vygotsky did not feel that faded over time. And I have a tendency to believe him. He felt that private speech became internalized, meaning it was so important for us to be in these social environments, for us to be able to learn, that we internalize that speech when we're alone. And as adults, we talk our way through things. And I'm sure many of you can probably recognize that. You might not do it out loud. I do. I'll talk out loud to myself and I'll walk myself through steps in a process, or I'm learning something and I'm repeating the instructions out loud. So Vygotsky really kind of identified that as a very, very important thing. And that's kind of where they had the split in terms of theory, split from Piaget into into Vygotsky. Now, what happened is Vygotsky's work, even though it was published in the 1920s, it had a resurgence in the West when the world of education was moving away from the strictly constructivist internalizing process and taking into account the social nature of the classroom or whatever situation in which somebody was learning, including situations of adult learning like training programs and college and all those things, that the social world was becoming a more and more important factor in terms of learning. So we see Vygotsky's work rising to the surface here with his notion of the social nature of learning, and constructivism now turns into, it didn't really change a lot, but it comes into social constructionism. And what social constructionism really validates is, yes, we are assimilating and accommodating information and building schemas, but that these exist and are modified and they're enhanced or limited by the social environments in which we learn. The social environments has an impact on that process. So we often learn not only the facts, as a scientist would learn the facts, but we learn those within the social context. And that's where we can see a real formulation of bias, of social issues and controversies and what that may or may not be based on scientific fact, but it is the impact of the social environment on our construction of facts, such that we may be selective in terms of how we build up those concepts. And certainly as I'm creating this video, there's lots of things going on in the world where we see a social construction of reality that is may or may not be based on entirely scientific facts. So we look back here on my graphic here, we have Lev Vygotsky, a little different from Piaget in that he felt that private speech continued, but that it became internalized. I strongly agree with that. He also said that learning occurs within a social context, and that's where we get this kind of really precise model that Vygotsky gave us called the Zone of Proximal Development. Now, the Zone of Proximal Development is both a model of learning in and of itself and how we experience things in the world when we're trying to learn them, but it also has to do, it's very instructional, it's very informative in terms of how teachers would structure the environment in which students are learning, having to do with kind of, it kind of embodies in the learning environment what I learned in the rehabilitation environment, which in that world was essentially meeting the client where they are, in terms of their development or their understanding, is rather than standing outside and saying, come to me, that developmental process of come to me, kind of have to meet them first where they are and lead them to a new place. So to represent this particular theory, I have a graphic, kind of a simplistic graphic of the processes of learning that take knowledge itself. Let's say something like maybe it's like word comprehension. Now, at any point in our life, we can take a point, and there are words that we know that are easy, and we understand, and we've mastered those words. And then there are words that we don't understand. They're above our heads. They're beyond us. And then there's words and language that we can be in the process of learning. It's just hard enough that with a little help we can get it. And that's what Vygotsky referred to as the zone of proximal development. exemplified in this particular graphic here. We have our comfort zone in the middle. These are things that we can do already by ourselves. We have the anxiety zone. Things are over our head. And then we have the zone of proximal development. These are things that are close to where our learning level is. And we can expand this really. This is applicable across the lifespan, because I know all of us, even as adults, have sometimes felt that something is too easy. Something might be over our heads and too hard, and then we might feel comfortable in that area of learning. When we want to learn something new, we kind of are on that edge, and that's where that learning really occurs. Now, when I was growing up, I have a very concrete example of this, and those of you who are in your 50s and maybe in your 40s, you might remember in your early childhood school years a system called SRA cards. Now, SRA was, I think it stood for Systematic Reading Assessment or Activity. And what it was, what I remember was this big box. It's my favorite thing to do. And there was cards in it, and each one of these cards was a reading assignment with some questions. Just a couple paragraphs at the beginning. And they were color-coded, across, moving up in this box. And the different colors represented different levels of reading. And so as you advanced, you became more adept at more complex reading. So you go one by one until you got through all of them. Now, interestingly enough, we're going to throw in another theorist here. We have the theorist of Marie Montessori. Now, Montessori, her techniques that she used in her schools, and modern day Montessori schools use this as well, is that if you take an activity, or let's say a group of activities, and you arrange them in a way that they are developmentally increasingly complex, that the child will enter in and through their natural level of curiosity will skip over all the things that they can already master. That's too easy, I'm done. And they'll center themselves on the area that interests them the most and challenges them just a little bit, essentially finding their own zone of proximal development, and will not move on, or not for long, will not move on to other complex activities because they're too frustrating and they don't understand those things yet. So they find their zone of proximity. Teachers who are structuring learning activities, it's a little challenging because you might have a diverse zone of proximal development, but certainly when we have prerequisites for a class, we're really kind of asking individuals to have mastered a certain number of things comfortably, so that we can then present material that's just advanced over that into the zone of proximal development. But I, as a teacher, know that I have sometimes had lectures or gone over concepts in my class that were way above, and my particular audience was not ready to hear those things, and I had gone into that area of anxiety, and anxiety was real. The students that were in my class were thinking, like, am I going to have to know? I don't understand this. Am I going to have to know this? Or is Mark just going down one of his rabbit holes at this point, which was usually the case. And sometimes I would bring it back and then connect it to concepts that were closer to their zone of proximal development, or maybe way back, you remember when we talked about this particular area, or what you took an intro to psych and connected to that, to try and bring those topics into the more, the learning area of the zone of proximal development. So as you can see, the individuals around you, okay, in the social nature of learning, according to Vygotsky, ideally, when you're in a learning situation, you are in a position where, because this is social, there are others around you, either a teacher or more experienced peers, and their presence allows you to experiment with your own comfort level and zone of proximal development. Good teachers or good instructors and good trainers will actually walk you through that process, understanding their own experience with that learning, and keep you nice and challenged and comfortable in that zone of proximal development. Now, we can consider this in all of its ways. We can apply this to our own learning, our history of learning, when we're trying to learn something new, when we want to teach somebody something, when we're experiencing information coming in to us, and what do we already understand, what is above our heads, and what is in that zone of proximal development. So the ZPD, as we refer to it, is a very useful tool for understanding the learning process, understanding when people are bored in school and when they're overwhelmed. And you can probably imagine, if you look at this from like the gifted and talented perspective, a gifted and talented person, their zone of proximal development is way far out. So maybe everything that's going on in the classroom is easy. It's in that easy, comfortable place, and they're bored. Conversely, if an individual has a developmental disorder or they have a particular learning disability, there may be barriers that keep what should be in that easy is actually not in that easy area. So everything is either a challenge to learn and it's exhausting, or it's above their current state in that particular area of knowledge. So that's what today's work is about, and I hope you enjoyed this particular video, and please subscribe so you can get notifications as to when my next video come out, and have a great day.